the news tonight, His Majesty the King tells leaders of U.S. Jewish organizations in Washington they have a crucial role to play with U.S. decision makers in pushing for lasting peace in the Middle East. The government of Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour wins a vote of confidence by the lower house of parliament during a parliament session this afternoon, ending a week-long debate of the government policy. And more than 30 people are killed in Iraq in violence in Kirkuk and Diyala, the worst fighting the country has seen since protests began in December against Prime Minister Maliki. Good evening and welcome to a new edition of the news. Here are the details. His Majesty the King stressed the important role that U.S. Jewish organizations can play in pushing for lasting peace in the Middle East. He said Jewish groups can play a crucial role in joint international efforts seeking the revival of the process and ending a stalemate in talks that has lasted for several years now. Speaking during a meeting with leaders of Jewish organizations in Washington, His Majesty said the Palestinian conflict will continue to ignite tension in the region unless it is resolved. He called on the Jewish community in the U.S. to exert efforts with U.S. decision makers to bring Palestinians and Israelis back to the negotiating table, leading to the establishment independent Palestinian state that can coexist peacefully along with Israel. Yesterday, His Majesty delivered a similar message during a meeting with Arab and Muslim organizations in the U.S., saying that they can have a key role to play in building bridges of understanding between the Arab and Western worlds. His Royal Highness Prince Faisal bin Al-Hussein discussed with U.S. Visiting Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel ongoing developments in the Middle East. Hagel is in Jordan as part of a tour of the region. Discussions in the presence of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mish'al Mohammed al-Zabin, also dealt with Jordanian-U.S. ties as well as military cooperation between the two armed forces. The government of Abdullah Mansour won a vote of confidence by the lower house during a parliament session this afternoon. 82 of the 149 deputies voted in favor. House Speaker Saad Al-Sroor congratulated the Prime Minister for the victory, after which this session was declared adjourned. Zain Abu Sufa has a story.
Has been described as a marathon debate and wrangling over the ability of the government of Abdullah Mansour to handle a host of national challenges and regional threats. The House voted, and Abdullah Mansour won the vote of confidence.
And by this, the government of Dr. Mansour has gained the majority of deputies' votes. Congratulations, Mr. Prime Minister.
82 deputies voted in favor of the government, 66 against, while one House member was absent and one abstained. In a reply to deputies' comments over the past week during the government policy debate, Mansour said his government values the constitutional and political status of the lower house, saying its prestige is an integral part of the prestige of the state. He said he will work hard to ensure the success of parliamentary governments, promising wise and careful but accelerated steps towards a partnership between government and parliament.
I entered parliamentary consultations with an open mind and a declared intent to form a parliamentary government to achieve the aspirations of His Majesty the King and the Jordanian people. However, I realized it was practically impossible, as consultations we have witnessed have resulted in numerous nominations and recommendations. I was faced with the decision to choose names on personal rather than political or institutional basis. Accordingly, and because I was keen to ensure the success of this experience, I took what I thought was a wise decision to delay the promised parliamentary government until such consultations on this historic move is institutional.
Over the past 5 days, MPs took the floor to present their comments and grievances. Echoing the concerns of their constituencies, they spoke of such national woes as corruption, poverty, unemployment, and low wages, demanding tangible steps by the government to resolve these pressing issues. And now that Mansour has won the House's confidence, and months ahead will see how he and his cabinet members will work to fulfill promises made. Zain Abu Sufa, News at 10.
Palestinian prisoner Samer al-Isawi, who has been on an on-off hunger strike in an Israeli prison, will have an early release. He ended his hunger strike, which has stoked weeks of protests in the West Bank, in exchange for his early release. A deal signed by Isawi and an Israeli military prosecutor, he will serve 8 more months for violating bail conditions from an earlier release. He will then be allowed to go to his home in Jerusalem. Israel convicted Isawi of opening fire on an Israeli bus in 2002, but released him in 2011, along with more than 1,000 prisoners, in exchange for an Israeli soldier held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. He was rearrested last July after Israel said he violated the terms of his release by crossing from East Jerusalem to the West Bank and ordered him to stay in jail until 2029. Palestinian Minister of Prisoners Isa Qaraqi said he considers the move a great victory, not only for Isawi, but for all prisoners and citizens who want freedom. And we stay in the region, and Minister Tayyip Erdogan said he will not reschedule his trip to the Gaza Strip. His decision came despite a request by the United States made during a visit by Secretary of State John Kerry to Turkey on Sunday. Kerry had asked Erdogan to delay his visit to avoid endangering U.S. efforts to revive Ankara's ties with Israel and Middle East peace talks. But Erdogan said to delay his trip is out of the question. He said he will visit the Gaza Strip following an official visit to the United States in May. Erdogan's trip would take place at a critical period for Turkish-Israeli relations, frozen after the killing by Israeli Marines of 9 Turks aboard a Gaza-bound aid ship in 2010. In Iraq, at least worshippers were killed when mortar rounds landed on an Iraqi Sunni mosque in Miqdadiyya in Diyala province, northeast of Baghdad. Earlier, at least 23 people were killed when Iraqi security forces stormed a Sunni protest camp near Kirkuk, triggering a gun battle between troops and protesters and provoking insurgent attacks on other areas. It was the worst fighting Iraq has seen since thousands of Sunnis started staging in December to demand an end to perceived marginalization of their sect by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's Shiite-led government. Here's more.
Sirens blaring, emergency vehicles rush to a Kirkuk hospital after a deadly raid by Iraqi security forces on a Sunni Muslim anti-government protest camp on Tuesday. At least 26 people are dead and scores wounded after a gun battle between the two sides, according to military sources. Iraq's defense ministry has no official death toll and said troops responded after coming under fire from gunmen in the makeshift camp. Protest leaders said they were unarmed when security forces opened fire during the early morning raid. Though demonstrators and officials gave conflicting accounts, military sources said 6 troops and 20 demonstrators were killed in the clashes. Thousands of Sunni Muslims have staged regular protests for months to demand an end to perceived marginalization by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's Shiite-led government. Many Sunnis say they have been sidelined since the U.S.-led 2003 invasion that ended Sunni strongman Saddam Hussein and allowed the Shiite majority to gain power through elections.
U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry said NATO needs to consider its role in the Syrian crisis, including how prepared it is to respond to a potential chemical weapons threat to any of its alliance members. Kerry spoke at a NATO foreign ministers meeting in Brussels, where he held with Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov on international security issues, including efforts to de-escalate tensions on the Korean Peninsula and Syria peace efforts. NATO Secretary General Anders Fogh Rasmussen said NATO is extremely concerned about the use of ballistic missiles in Syria and the possible use of chemical weapons. Speaking at a news conference, Rasmussen said the situation in Syria has dramatically deteriorated, continues to pose a threat to regional stability. He expressed NATO's worry about the risk of the conflict spilling over Syria's borders, but added NATO is ready to defend and protect its allies. On the ground, meanwhile, fighting continued in several parts of Syria. Amateur video showed rebels fighting Hezbollah forces in Qusayr, near Syria's border with Lebanon. further south, and despite several announcements from the government that the Damascus suburb of Daraya has been subdued, amateur footage continues to show heavy fighting in the area. Elsewhere, kidnappers freed 2 Syrian bishops who have been abducted in the northern city of Aleppo, but the identities of their kidnappers remained uncertain. The bishops were seized yesterday near Aleppo, which is contested by rebels and loyal to President Bashar al-Assad. The authorities blamed rebels for the incident, but rebels in the province denied they had kidnapped the 2, that they were trying to find out who had taken them. And on another front, Syria to the UN Security Council, saying the European Union had no right to buy crude oil from the opposition after the EU eased an embargo to help those fighting President Bashar al-Assad. In the letter, Syria said no party can take any measure that would prejudice the sovereign rights of states over their natural resources for the benefit of the opposition, adding that the opposition represents foreign interests. Rebel fighters are in control of most oil-producing regions of Syria, and some rebel groups have fought with local tribes over resources in the country's oil-rich east. France's foreign minister flew out to Libya to visit the French embassy in the capital after it was attacked this morning in the latest violence since the U.S. ambassador was killed in Benghazi last year. The Libyan foreign minister condemned as a terrorist act the attack on the French embassy and announced the formation of a French-Libyan investigation team to probe the incident. Here's more.
The aftermath of a blast targeting the French embassy in the Libyan capital Tripoli. The Tuesday morning assault that injured 2 French guards appears to be the work of a car bomb. It is the first attack on a diplomatic mission in the city, which is considered safer than any other following the 2011 war that ousted leader Muammar Gaddafi. Residents near the incident say they heard 2 blasts detonate around 7 a.m. local time. So far, no one has claimed responsibility for the bombing. But Al-Qaeda's North African arm has repeatedly threatened to retaliate for French intervention in Mali. Libya is no stranger to embassy assaults. Last year, the American ambassador was killed in the eastern city of Benghazi following an attack on the consulate in September. French officials, including President François Hollande, have condemned the bombing.
Iran said that it would be a reliable partner in the Middle East if Western countries would take a more cooperative approach in talks on its nuclear program. Ali Asghar Sultaniya, Iran's ambassador to the United Nations Nuclear Watchdog Agency, said current U.S. and European policies, including extensive sanctions on Tehran, were bound to fail. Sultaniya told a meeting in Geneva on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that Western countries are advised to change from to cooperation. Meanwhile, the IAEA said it will hold a new meeting with Tehran on the 15th of next month, aimed at enabling its inspectors to resume a stalled investigation into suspected bomb research by Iran. The announcement made today by IAEA spokesperson Gil Tudor said the agency and Iran have agreed to hold further talks in Vienna on May 15th. Pakistani lawyers clashed with supporters of former President Pervez Musharraf when the retired general appeared before an anti-terrorism court in the city of Rawalpindi. Musharraf arrived at the court under heavy security to face allegations that he had failed to provide adequate security to prevent the assassination of former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto in 2007. The former president is also facing allegations that he overstepped his powers in a showdown with the judiciary in the same year when he placed judges under house arrest. Musharraf was allowed to consult his lawyers in the court before he was driven back to his home, which has been declared a sub-jail until May 4th. France's parliament gave its final seal of approval to a historic law legalizing same-sex marriage and adoption, a flagship reform pledged by President François Hollande. The atmosphere was charged in the National Assembly, which led to opponent members being removed from the chamber before the announcement of the vote backing the government's landmark bill. France, a mainly Catholic country, was 13 others, including Canada, Denmark, Sweden, and most recently Uruguay and New Zealand, in allowing same-sex marriage. In the United States, Washington, D.C. and 9 states have legalized same-sex marriage. A power station in East London is to use greasy buildups from Thames Water's drains, known as fatbergs, as fuel to generate electricity. The power plant aims to generate a total of 130 gigawatt hours per year of renewable electricity, enough for some 40,000 homes. When up and running, the plant will be the world's largest fat-fueled power station. Here's a story.
We may want fat in our diet, but give little thought to what happens to waste cooking oil and fat, especially when it's poured down the drain. Deep below London streets, the results are all too clear. This is what happens to leftover fat which goes down the plug hole. It cools and becomes fatbergs, which clog up the city sewers.
That's disgusting, yeah it is.
Now the waste oil and fat is to be used to power a new electricity plant, making life easier for flushers like Rob Smith.
Every couple of months we come through and we'll flush that through. If it doesn't happen on a storm, if it doesn't happen naturally, flushing it out means that we have to pump the downstream sewer down to get the level down below the fat levels, so that we've got a clear avenue for the fat to go through, because fat will just float on the top of the sewage.
It costs Thames Water £10 million a year to clear blockages, and half of them are caused by fat. In future, they want to collect waste fogs, fat, oils and grease directly from fat traps under the sinks of 10,000 restaurants. That will power the world's biggest fat-fuelled power station. It'll be built in East London. Developer 2OC has to get the power plant up and running by the 1st of April 2015 to qualify for full government subsidies. And the project is expected to be closely watched by other major cities, keen to slim down their fat deposits.
The organizers of the 2014 Winter Olympics, to be held in the Russian city of Sochi, have refused to comment about possible security threats to the Games in the wake of the Boston bombings. Sochi is situated just a few hundred kilometers from most restive North Caucasus provinces. The bombings of the Boston Marathon have been blamed on 2 men whose family is from Chechnya in the North Caucasus region. Security at the Olympics is expected to be taken to high extremes, with soldiers outnumbering spectators in some events. Manchester United won their 20th English League title last night. A Robin van Persie hat-trick led them to a 3-0 victory over Aston Villa and gave them an unassailable 16-point lead over last season's champions Manchester City. Van Persie's goals came after 2, 13 and 33 minutes. The victory is the 13th Premier League title for both the club and Sir Alex Ferguson, who has now won 49 club trophies in his managerial career. And so the Champions League first leg semi-final between Bayern Munich and Barcelona kicked off at the Allianz Arena in Munich. Lionel Messi, who has been struggling with a hamstring strain, is participating. Both teams are dominating their leagues, and the match is set to offer up challenges for both sides, looking for a spot in the final in Wembley. Matches between Bayern and Barcelona have been surprisingly rare, with just 6 previous. And so far, Bayern is leading 1-0 after a goal from Thomas Müller. And finally, for a quick look at the weather, relatively cold and partly cloudy tonight with northwesterly light winds. But a slight rise in temperature is expected tomorrow, creating fair weather in most regions with northeasterly moderate winds. The Gulf of Aqaba should expect relatively hot conditions tomorrow with northerly moderate to fresh winds and calm seas. Here now is a look at temperatures forecast for tonight and tomorrow. And to close, here's a reminder of the day's top stories. His Majesty the King tells leaders of U.S. Jewish organizations in Washington they have a crucial role to play with U.S. decision makers in pushing for lasting peace in the Middle East. The government of Prime Minister Abdullah Mansour wins a vote of confidence by the lower house of Parliament during a Parliament session this afternoon, ending a week-long debate of the government policy. And more than 30 people are killed in Iraq in violence in Kirkuk and Diyala, the worst fighting the country has seen since protests began in December against Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. And with this, we come to the end of this edition of the news. I'm Alia Tuqan. Thank you for joining us and have a good night.